peeps, it's Kat. Welcome to the YouTube channel run by 3 crafty kitties and their human servant. Today I have a ridiculously cute Christmas card for you that will feature my very own furry troublemakers, some heat embossing, some alcohol marker coloring, and some ink blending. I got a Christmas cat stamp set from Simon Says Stamp, and I don't know about you, but if I see a stamp set with kitties, 99% chance I'm buying it. The guy messing with the Christmas tree is definitely my orange cat who never had a turn with a brain cell. The guy wrapped in Christmas lights is definitely my black void kitty. I can't tell you how many light strands this guy chewed on and ruined over the years. And as to the third cat, well, she's old and doesn't do much. Her favorite pastime is sleeping and terrorizing people for treats. I also have the coordinating dies that cut out all of the kitties and all of the greetings, some clear embossing powder, and an anti-static powder tool. Let's get started, shall we? Today I'm going to try something I've never done before. I'm going to heat emboss the images before I color them with alcohol markers. I want to test if what people on the internet are saying is true, namely that embossing the images first helps you stay within the lines better when you color. What I also heard is that coloring this way could potentially damage your markers because of how the embossing powder reacts with the alcohol ink. Basically, the word on the street is that the alcohol ink from the markers can melt the embossing powder, and that can ruin the tips of your markers by clogging them. So I guess we will find out by the end of this video. I have arranged my stamps on a panel of plain white cardstock, and I'm using all of the cats for a couple of reasons. One, I can't decide which one I want to use for my third cat, and two, if I mess up the coloring, I don't want to restamp and redo the embossing. This way I have plenty to choose from, even if I mess up. Before I used the stamps for the first time, I needed to condition them to remove the manufacturing residue so that they stamp better. So I just rubbed my finger all over the stamps. I'm inking up my stamps with my favorite pigment ink. This is VersaFine Clear Nocturne. Because this ink stays wet on your cardstock for longer, you can easily emboss with it. Before I stamp the images for the first time, I should have used my anti-static powder tool here, but I forgot. Anti-static powder just helps prevent the embossing powder from sticking where it shouldn't. When you're handling your cardstock panel, the oils from your fingers can leave fingerprints. You don't really see them with a naked eye, but the embossing powder loves to stick to those. That's why anti-static powder is pretty crucial here. Since I'll be using the clear embossing powder for the images, I'll be okay in the end. It's a little more forgiving than colored embossing powders, but for any other embossing powder, I definitely recommend using your anti-static powder first. Okay, so I stamped my images several times to saturate the paper with enough ink, and I'm bringing out a piece of printer paper folded in half and my embossing powder. I will dump the contents of the jar onto the images, and the wet ink will make that powder stick. The folded printer paper is just there to catch all of the embossing powder I'm dumping out. I am using a lot of powder here because I want to ensure good coverage. I'm holding my panel relatively flat so it gives the powder some time to stick to the wet ink. Once the images are covered, I will just tilt the panel and let that powder slide off. I don't know if you can see, but it looks kind of matte now. That's usually your sign that you have enough coverage. And if I feel like I've missed a spot, I can always go back and add more powder to those spots. I heat set this off screen, and there you go. Our images are now shiny and have that ever so slightly raised edge. Since I already have my MISTI out, I will also stamp the greetings. I've picked Wishing You a Meowy Christmas, Merry Mischief, and Merry Catmas. I'll admit I'm a big sucker for cat puns. I will heat emboss these guys too, but I wasn't sure at first which color would go better with what I had in mind for the card, gold or silver, so I will do both. So for my images, I wanted a black outline. That's why I embossed with the black ink and clear powder. But for the sentiments, I'll be using a clear embossing ink and colored embossing powder. This time I didn't forget to use my anti-static powder tool, so I'm just spreading this powder all over my panel, like really going at it. Once I'm sure I covered the entire panel, I will just blow on it to remove the extra powder. If you get any of it over your working surface, it cleans up pretty easily with a wet paper towel. I quickly conditioned my stamps, and I'm bringing out my clear embossing ink. Spoiler alert, we will have a little adventure here. I inked up my stamps and stamped it per usual, and everything looked fine at first. Then I re-inked my stamps and went to stamp it again. Everything looked fine the second time around too. Then I went to stamp it the third time, and what in the world is this? These stamps are brand new, and when I looked at them, they looked clean, so I thought that's weird, but okay, let me just move the panel up and restamp. I'm trying my best not to handle the paper with my fingers here because I don't want to leave those fingerprints. I just made sure that my stamps don't overlap, inked them up again, and stamped again. And when I opened my MISTI door, boom, I have the weird black splotch out of nowhere again. At this point, I'm like, what is happening? So I cleaned off the stamps really well with the stamp chamois, and I finally thought to look at my ink pad. And there was our culprit. I have no idea how exactly this black ink ended up on my ink pad, but if I had to guess, I probably accidentally picked it up from the MISTI door after I stamped the cat images. But here's what you do if that happens to you. Grab a small piece of paper towel and rub it over your ink pad to pick up that smudge. Just gently rub it on the surface until it's fully gone. This will pick up some ink from the ink pad itself, so if your splotch is big, you might need to re-ink the pad. Just keep that in mind. I decided to redo the greeting, so I grabbed a new panel, applied my anti-static powder again, inked the stamps, and stamped again. When I opened the door, the ink still looked kind of dirty, but at this point I was like, we're just rolling with it. I'm not redoing this again. I was hoping that the colored embossing powder would just cover my mistakes, and I was actually right. In the end, it didn't even matter. I took a couple of stampings to get all of the dirty ink off though. Since I'm embossing in both gold and silver, I need two sets of sentiments. So I flipped my panel upside down here and put it back in the left corner of my MISTI. This way I knew I had enough room for both sets on one sheet and I can emboss them all at once. I stamped it a couple of times, and as you can see, that ink pad finally started stamping clean again. Once I'm done with all my stamping, I will remove my panel from the MISTI and bring out my printer paper and embossing powder again. First, I'm gonna do the silver. This is Ranger embossing powder, and I sprinkled the contents of the jar over only one section of my stamping, making sure that I leave the other stamp section untouched. Slide that powder off, tap the panel with your fingers to get rid of the stragglers, and just quickly make sure that there's enough powder coverage. Once that's done, I will funnel my silver powder back into the jar and will bring out my gold one. This is also Ranger, and I will have a full list of all of the supplies listed in the description box. So same process here. Carefully sprinkle your powder over the stamping and make sure you have enough coverage everywhere, then gently flick the panel to get rid of the stray powder. Now, before I melt the powder with the heat gun, I do want to do a little cleanup of those especially stubborn particles. So I just brought out a tiny brush and I'm going over the panel, barely touching the paper. After I've made sure that all the stray powder is gone, I'll heat set this. And here you go, beautiful sentiments and no dirty ink inside. Okay, we're moving on to the coloring. I'm not gonna lie, I am definitely no fancy colorist, so I have to remind myself every time I color something that the only way to get better is to keep practicing. I'm starting off with the tree as I first want to get comfortable before I move on to the kitties. I'm laying down my first layer of color. I know some people like to put down the shadows or the darkest color first. I, for some reason, find it intimidating, so I like to start my coloring with the lightest color first. At this point, I'm not overly concerned with any streaks, I just want to get a base layer down. I'm careful not to go over the embossed parts of the images because I don't want to melt the powder with the alcohol ink. Though I gotta say, heat embossing first definitely helps you stay within the lines better. It creates this slightly raised edge, or a well, if you will, that prevents the ink from spreading into the other areas. Now I'm going in with the second layer of the same color to get rid of any streaking. The trick here is to saturate the paper, overlap your strokes, and to move as fast as you humanly can without getting too messy. If you wanted to, you could leave this as is without adding any shadows, and it would still look super cute. Especially if you're just starting out with the alcohol markers, try to keep it simple until you get more comfortable. I wanted to make my images a little more dimensional, so I will attempt to do some shading here. I have a darker green color here, and I'm starting at the edge of my tree and bringing in the strokes into the center with a kind of a flicking motion. I'm not too concerned with the harsh lines just yet, I just want to get the basic shadows down first, so I'm trying to think where those shadows would usually be. And typically that's at the edges and where the objects would overlap. So I put some shadows down under the star and around the edge of the tree. Then I will bring back my lighter green again and we'll go over the transition to help blend those two colors together. Next, I'm gonna color my ornaments and my tree topper, so I will bring out some light blue and some yellow here. I will also add some minimal shading here with the darker blue and the darker yellow. And just like with the tree, I will go back in with the lighter color to smooth out my transitions. These areas are pretty small, so I'm not gonna bother with anything more than just a super basic shadow on one side of the ornaments and on one side of the star. If you ever feel like you've blended out your shadow too much, just go back in with the darker color again. That's what I ended up doing for the star on the tree. Also, guys, please keep in mind that this portion is really sped up. This is playing at 2.5 times the speed. I don't color this fast in real life. I really wish I did, but it takes a hot minute. I'm not sure if it's the actual trunk of the tree or just the pot that it's sitting in, but I figured that brown was pretty safe bet here. So I brought out 2 shades of brown and colored it in with the lighter color first, and then the darker color for the shadow, and went back in with the lighter color to blend the two. Now, let's color the first kitty. I'm not good at all at blending colors into white, and whenever I try to do it, it just ends up looking super harsh no matter how hard I try to blend it. So I brought out the palest of yellows here. This particular color looks just slightly off-white when it dries, so I'm going over the entire cat to lay down my basic layer. I did this in hopes that it will make the transitions from orange to white less harsh. In the end, it didn't even matter because I sort of messed up the coloring anyways. So my cat is a tuxedo orange, and he looks like he's wearing an orange coat, but his chest and part of his face are white, so that's what I tried to replicate here. I went in with the slightly darker orangey yellow and brought in the color from the edges into the center in a flicking motion, and then went back with the lightest yellow to blend the transition. Then with the medium orange color, I repeated the process but made sure to leave a little bit of that lighter orange peeking out. So I'm basically layering my shades of orange here the best I can. And this is where I made a little oopsie. I tried to give this chunky cat a chin. That was a mistake, and this just didn't look good in my opinion. I tried to save it by blending it first with the second lightest orange, but I felt like it didn't really help all that much. So I tried blending it with the lightest yellow, and it didn't really do much either. So I took a deep breath and have decided to leave it alone for a moment so that I can have a minute to think of a way to fix it. In the meantime, I brought out my darkest orange to create stripes and add the details here. I drew in the stripes in that flicking motion and tried adding in some shadows here and there for more dimension, like around his paws. I also added the stripes to the tail. I went over the stripes the second time to make them a little darker, and at this point there was no more delaying the inevitable. That splotchy look was really bothering me, so I made an executive decision to just fill in the cat with orange completely. Sorry, Monty, Mama done you dirty here. This is not your exact likeness, but I think he will forgive me. Next, I'm moving on to the little Santa head. I will admit I struggled a bit with the color selection here. For some reason, my first red did not feel Christmassy enough for me, so I went over it with a different red. You can actually get a rainbow of different colors by layering your markers like this. I tried to do a shadow with an even darker red, but this was not showing up well at all. I tried a couple of different reds here, but it just wasn't working. So I decided to bring in a lightish gray to do the shadows, and that showed up quite nicely. So I went over the Santa head and the kitty itself. I drew a thin gray line at the edge of his tail and just at the edges of his body to give him more dimension, and also anywhere I felt like the natural shadows would be, where the head meets his head and the ornament meets his paw. And I feel like it really did the trick. I feel like that made the little guy look a little more 3D. Here's a close-up for you. I think it came up pretty darn cute despite my little mistake here. I don't like leaving anything white if I can help it, so for the fuzzy part of his head, I brought out the very lightest blue I had, and I used it to create a shadow of sorts and then blended it with the colorless blender. The black kitty was actually the hardest to color. Part of the reason is because my embossed lines are also black, so if I would have just gone in with pure black marker, there would have been very little definition. So instead, I'm opting for a dark gray first in hopes of maintaining at least a little bit of a highlight effect. It won't show up on camera very well here, but in real life you can see that little bit of difference. So I'm laying down my first layer of color here, and I know it looks just like black on camera, but it's really just a very dark gray. I will note here that the rumor that alcohol markers melt embossing powder are actually true. In the area where there's a string of lights going across his body, I got a little too close to the line, and my ink from the marker melted some of the embossing. It's not super noticeable, but that's something to keep in mind if you're coloring an image with a lot of embossed lines. Once I've filled in the image with dark gray, I'm going in with an even darker gray. And similar to how I colored the orange cat, I'm just starting at the edge of the body and bringing in the darker color into the center with a flicking motion. I know on camera this kitty looks like a little chupacabra, but in real life there is a bit of color difference. And you can see that the face portion is ever so slightly lighter than the rest of his body. Because I used a lighter gray first, this is creating that highlight effect around his face. I will then go back with my first gray and will blend out the transitions between the two colors. And then I'll bring out my pure black marker and we'll go around the image at the very edges to darken it even further. So again, I'm layering my colors here from lightest to darkest. I will color in the lights with some yellow I used for the tree topper, and I didn't bother with any shading here because the areas are just so tiny. For the Santa hat, after the struggle with the first one, I've settled on using just two reds, R170 and R4, and that lightish gray for the shadow. I went in with R170 first, then laid down the shadow with gray, and then blended everything with R4. And I used that light blue again and the colorless blender for the fuzzy part of the head. I will go in with a light pink to color in the tongue and the ears. And here's a little close-up for you. So cute. For my third kitty, I initially messed up the coloring, so I'm just redoing it here. My third cat has two black spots on her back, and I tried to freehand it on that first image I colored, and it did not go over well. But hey, that's exactly the reason I stamped multiple images. If I mess up, I have a backup plan. So similar to the black cat, I went in with a lighter gray first, then brought in a darker gray around the edges, and then went in with the black to darken it further. I colored the head the exact same way as before, R170 first, then gray shadow, then blended everything with R4. And then used light blue for the fuzzy part of the head. Here's a little close-up for you, but it's not fully done yet. Next, I'm going in with a white gel pen to brighten up the eyes. It doesn't look like much on camera, but it does make a difference in real life, especially where I might have colored over the embossing. It just makes the eyes stand out a little more. Here I realized that I forgot to color in the ears on one of the kitties, so I'm gonna go back in and fix it. And while I'm at it, I will also give that kitty a little blep. I will also add in some shadows just on the edges of the body to make the cat more dimensional, and I'll go over the gray with the colorless blender to smooth out that transition. Here I cut all of the images out, and look how cute they are. I might not be the best colorist, but I think the kitties came out super adorable, and I went ahead and also cut the sentiments. Okay, it's time to work on the background panel. I want to build my scene with a frame and snow slopes, so I'm bringing out some arched dies and I'm trying to decide on the size. The largest one is too big, so I had to size down. And then to make a frame, I will pick the next die that's two sizes down. So if you're counting from the outside in, it will be the second and the fourth arch. I will line the dies up and I will tape them in place with a lot of tape. The plain white frame I'm cutting out first will be just the backing, and I will need to cut another piece that will go on top. So I want my dies to stay taped together. This way I don't have to line them up again. And here's my first piece. I'm carefully removing it while making sure I don't accidentally dislodge the dies. For the top piece of my frame, I decided to go with the glitter cardstock. This one is from Tonic Studios. It has this slightly iridescent white shimmer that resembles snow, so I think it's going to be perfect for a winter card. And because I kept my dies taped together, I don't have to worry about the two frames being off or not fitting together properly. Next, I'm going to work on my snow hills or snow slopes. You don't really need dies for this. You can simply cut them by hand in a wavy line, but I wanted some extra detail, so I'll be using Lawn Fawn dies that will create a stitched edge for me. Here's a little tip for you. If your dies are not detabbed, you first need to snap them apart. You can try doing this with your hands, but an easier way is to get the wire cutters, snap them apart first, and then for the tiny pieces of metal that are still sticking out, you just grab it with the cutters and twist it. That usually removes them right off, and you don't have pieces of metal flying into your mouth or eyes on accident. You want to remove those tiny sharp pieces because, trust me, you don't need blood all over your project. Ask me how I know. When you're taping your dies down, pay attention to where the stitching will be. I didn't pay attention here, and you will see that one of the hills came out just plain. The stitching is still there, it's just on that middle piece that still has dies on it. I first wanted to see how many hills I will need, so I'm playing around with the placement here with the frame. And I'm bringing in my kitties to see how much room they will need. I'm basically trying to figure out my winter scene with all of the elements. I really didn't like the look of that plain hill, so I will untape that middle portion and see what I can do with it. I feel like scene building is really just playing around with all of your elements until you're happy with the results. If you struggle with scene building, I encourage you to just bring in all of your die cuts and pieces in all at once and really just shift things around, tuck them in behind other layers if you can, and it's your card. Do what makes you happy. In the end, I settled on 3 hills, and I cut another stitched piece from that plain hill that I cut out initially. If things don't work out at first, just die cut them again. So that I don't forget in which order my slopes are gonna go, I numbered them with a pencil. None of this will be visible because we will cut the edges off and nothing will be sticking out from the frame. Next, I need a backing for my frame, and you could technically skip this part and just use a whole panel and then just cut off the excess, but I'm not a big fan of the ragged edges that sometimes form from cutting with the scissors, so I just found a die that fits kind of in between my frame, and this way I will know that it will fit perfectly and it will also help me ink blend faster. I want my back panel to resemble a night sky, so I'll bring in some purple and dark blue inks. I want my color to be concentrated mostly around the edges, and I want the middle to have some color too, but I want it to be more of a halo kind of effect. I quickly cleaned off my brush, loaded it up with some purple ink, and got to inking. I'm using dye inks here, so they will absorb into the paper faster, which means I gotta try to move somewhat fast here. I'm going around the edges of my panel and laying down some ink. This brush really needed to be cleaned properly because, as you can see, it's pretty splotchy. Simon inks are pretty forgiving and they usually smooth out considerably when they dry, but if your brush has accumulated too much ink, it can become kind of stiff and that can hinder your ink blending. It will get uneven and splotchy. And by the way, let me know in the comments if you'd like to see a video on how to clean your brushes. After fighting against that purple brush for a bit, I brought in a fresh one that's just much larger and will actually help me blend a larger area faster. And as you can see, the process went much smoother and easier. These brushes are from Pink Fresh and they're seriously awesome. In no way sponsored by Pink Fresh. I bought these with my own money, but I just really, really like them. They give you the softest blend and cover large areas really fast. And if you look in the very center, it's much lighter in color and the blend is very soft. So that creates that halo effect that I was talking about. This will just help draw the eye into the middle of the card. I will intermittently bring in my frame to make sure things line up how I want them to, and once I'm happy, I will move on to my darker ink. I will again clean off my brush on a cloth first, and then we'll go around the edges of the panel to intensify the color. I'm going for a night sky, so I want this to be pretty dark. I am making sure, though, to stay mostly on the very edges of my panel. Dye inks usually dry lighter than the color you see when you're blending, so I'm intentionally using a lot of ink here to ensure that it will stay dark enough when it's dry. And I'll also bring in my frame and my heels to make sure it all looks good together. Once I'm happy with the results, I'll move on to the next step. I want to do some snow on my background, so I'll bring in some white splatter paint. You could also use some white acrylic paint diluted with the tiniest bit of water, which is what I used to do for the longest time. But the splatter medium is supposed to be more opaque, so I wanted to try it out. And once it dried, it was actually more opaque than acrylic paint. But again, you don't need to buy or have all of the latest and greatest products to make cards. Just use what you have in your stash. I dipped my brush into the paint here and I'm just tapping it with my finger while moving it around my panel. Once that's done, I'm gonna ink blend my heels. I have a lighter blue ink here. This is Simon Says Stamp Cadet. It's a really pretty mid-tone blue. I just want to get some color variation at the very edges of the heels so that they stand out from each other a bit more. I'm doing my best to use a light hand here, which for me is often difficult since I tend to just go ham when ink blending, but I'm staying on the very edge of the cardstock, and I did that for all of 3 of my heels. I will then layer all of these together to check that it all looks nice. That little bit of ink on the edges just gives it some nice dimension and color variation. While my ink blended pieces are drying, I will glue my frame and my kitties together with some additional blank die cuts. I cut these from some plain white cardstock, and this is actually a great way to use up all of your scraps. I stack my die cuts to make them sturdier, and especially if you're gonna mail your cards, this will help prevent the creasing when the envelope goes through the sorting machine at the post office. And while my frame dries, I will put something heavy on it. I'm just using a case with my wax seals here. I plan on hand delivering this card. It's for my husband actually, so I didn't really need to worry about any creasing in the mail, but I plan on foam mounting the cats to the panel, so I still want my die cuts to be sturdy and not to bend when I press them down to adhere. Here's my dry background. The splatter didn't take all that long to dry, maybe 15 minutes in total. I will play around with the layout again until I get my final arrangement figured out. I will then make a mark on the edges of my heels that are sticking out so that I know where to place my frame once I go to glue everything all together. Now it's finally time to start assembling this card. My first heel I will glue flat to the back of the frame, so I'm just applying glue here to the very bottom portion. And I will line this up with the tick mark I made on the side earlier. This doesn't need to be too precise, the tick mark was just a guide. And I will put some magnets on the frame while the glue dries. I work on a magnetic glass surface, so these little magnets are really handy for holding things down. For my second layer, I will use some thin foam squares because I want just that little bit of separation. I will then peel off the backers, but before I tack on my second hill, I will cut off the excess here since it's easier to cut a single layer of cardstock than to fight against 2 or 3. I'm kind of trying to get ever so slightly under the frame here so that no edges stick out on the side. The foam squares usually tend to stick hard and fast, so to give myself more wiggle room, I will put some liquid glue on them, and this will give me some slip and will allow me to move things around if I need to. Once I got that into position, I will press this down and will also cut off the excess on the edges. For the third hill, I will use the thin foam squares again and then the liquid glue to help me wiggle it into place. Once that's done, again, cut off the edges so that nothing sticks out. Here I'm just doing a dry run of the assembly and my final checks. I'm arranging my kitties and trying to pick the sentiment. I went with the skinnier one because that just fit better. I wasn't sure if I wanted silver or gold, but in the end, I settled on the gold. Next, I need to attach my frame to the background. Because of all of the foam squares that I put on the hills, I now have a bit of a gap when I just laid the frame flat against the background. So I will just need to pop it up with some foam as well. I have some shaker foam strips here and I'm going to stick them all around the frame on the side. It's easier to curve them when you remove the backing first and then you can just bend them however you want, which is what I'm doing. I'm not putting anything on the bottom portion of the frame where I have the hills since I already have enough left from all of those foam squares. I will also put on some glue on top of the foam for that extra wiggle room, and I'm using a pretty generous amount here. I don't know about y'all, but for some reason I always struggle assembling my panel from the front. I always end up messing it up and getting glue everywhere. You're gonna see this in a second. Like, I managed to miss half the foam when I tried attaching it from the front. So I'll do what works best for me, which is flip it and attach it from the back so that I can see where I'm putting things. Since my panel is cut to fit perfectly inside the frame, I don't need to worry about being too precise. As long as I'm mostly center, I should be good to go. I had a bit of a gap on the bottom of my panel and I want to make sure that all parts of it are supported and there are no pieces just flopping around. So here's what you do. First, remove the backing from the foam square, then pick it up with your pokey tool, kind of from the side, slide it in between your layers where you think you need it, and then press it all down. Jumping a bit ahead here, I have already attached one of the kitties to the background with black foam squares. I use black because my background is dark, and when you use white squares on dark background, they are way more visible if you look at the card from the side. The black squares just to make it look more seamless. I will attach my other 2 kitties with foam squares as well. For the black and white one, I'm using thin squares, and I'm only putting it on the portion where the head is because it will be overlapping 2 hills. Basically, the body will be glued flat to the first hill, and the foam square will support the head portion that covers the second hill. I hope that makes sense. And of course, lots of glue here for the extra wiggle room. My black kitty will be mostly on the first hill, so I will use the thicker foam squares to attach him. I will confess I'm a bit of an over-adherer, so I usually use a lot of squares. I feel like it's better to have too much than not enough and deal with sagging die cuts. You see how I can move the cat ever so slightly? That's because of that glue on top of the foam. And here's our completed scene. I stacked my sentiment 3 layers thick, so the text portion and then 2 plain die cuts behind it. This will give it a bit of a lift from the panel. And I'm attaching it straight to the background and I will slide it around just a bit until I'm happy with the position. I got a half sheet, so 8.5 by 5.5, and I'm scoring it at 4.25 to be my side folding card base. I will burnish it with my Teflon Bone folder and will check for any overhangs or uneven edges. Before I proceed with the front of the card, I will glue in a white panel on the inside. This one was trimmed down by 1/4 inch on the short and the long sides, so 2 sides only, and this will give us a nice 1/8 of an inch trim all around. This will give me a sturdier card base and also a place to write a personal message. You don't necessarily need to do this, but there's a lot going on with the front, and if your cardstock is of a lighter nature, like 80 or 90 pounds, your card may become a little floppy when it's open just from the weight of all of the layers glued to the front. I put a magnet on the corner of the card to keep it closed, and I will adhere our card front directly to the base. There's a lot of dimension in the scene itself, so I don't need to bother with any foam tape here. I will center it the best I can and will also bring out my T-square ruler to help me make sure it's straight. I aligned the ruler with the bottom of the card base and then kind of slid down the frame into place. The bottom portion of the frame is straight, so it's pretty easy to just push that edge up against the edge of the ruler. Once I'm happy with the position, I will press it all down to adhere. And as a finishing touch, I will stamp the back of the card with my stamp. And of course, the cats get all the credit here. And there you go, a super cute winter scene with 3 adorable chunky kitties. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!